Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We'll wait a couple of more seconds for folks to join. For those of you already on the line, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, perfect, right. So first of all, I would like to thank everybody for taking the time and investing the time in this second event organized by the DACH Chapter of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, organized kindly by Thomas Janvier and Miroslav Pitlanic today. Very pleased that we have two amazing guest speakers to cover our topic, which is CBAM, which, by the way, is the topic that received the most votes on LinkedIn as area of interest for today's session. So, by the way, it's really great that we have an opportunity to cover a topic that everybody is interested in. So we have Gabriel Rozenberg from company CBAMBOO. He will be kicking us off pretty soon, and then Martin Becker, who is the department head of a unit at the European Commission on this specific topic. And then, of course, we have Miroslav here with us as well. He is one of our volunteers in the DACH chapter of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, and together, the three of them will be guiding us through today's session. Now, just a couple of housekeeping rules for everybody. We would love if you could just keep your questions, to the very end of the presentation so that we can stop the recording then and have the opportunity of having a very open discussion. If there's any questions for the speakers that you wish to address to them after the event, please feel free, to reach out to them either directly on LinkedIn, or if you wish to have your email address shared, you're more than welcome to put it into the chat box. We are very sensitive to the GDPR, respecting GDPR. So we want to make sure that everybody, feels comfortable in the treatment of your respective personal data. So with this, I would get started, and we'll take a look at the agenda briefly. So I already gave a brief introduction. Miroslav will be guiding us through the CBAM basic refresher. And then, yes, we have two very interesting, sessions with our speakers. We would then suggest to have, the Q&A session, which again will be offline. And then we'll spend a couple of minutes reminding everybody that has not already signed a pledge how to do that. And we will also be sharing a couple of dates related to, the next events which are organized for the World Sustainable Procurement Day. With that, handing over to you, Miroslav.
Thank you very much, Juliana. Hi, everyone. I'm Miroslav. Thanks for this opportunity to share a quick reminder about CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Now, CBAM is something we in procurement and supply chains should keep on our radar. It's part of the EU's plan to cut carbon emission and, importantly, to stop what's known as a carbon leakage. Basically, carbon leakage happens when companies shift production to countries with less strict environmental rules to save costs. CBAM aims to stop that by putting a carbon price on imports of certain goods, things like steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity. So what's happening next? If you have been importing these products, you need to report emissions linked to them. And by 2026, you will also have to buy CBAM certificates. This means paying a price for the carbon embedded in those imports. So what is there for us in procurement? Is there just another regulation to follow? No, it's a call to action. We will need better visibility into supply emissions. This means building stronger supplier relationships and working closely with them to cut emissions. It's also a great opportunity to rethink sourcing strategies and position ourselves as leaders in sustainable procurement. So CBAM isn't just about compliance. It's about staying competitive in a world that's moving towards greener supply chains. If we act now, we can turn this into an advantage, not just for our companies, but for the planet too. So thank you again, and I look forward for the rest of today's discussion.
Excellent. Now, thank you for that. Handing over to Gabriel.
Thank you very much. It's great to be talking to you all today. I'm Gabriel Rozenberg. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a business called CBAMBOO. We set this up almost 2 years ago because we could see that CBAM was going to be a complete game changer as a piece of regulation, and we wanted to be there for companies who are handling it, going through it, and build software that helps them in their processes around CBAM. So I'm here today to talk about what problems are being faced by industry and talk about some of the solutions. And I want to sort of divide this a little bit into some problems that are short-term, but also problems that are fixable with the legislation being tweaked in various ways. And that will hopefully set us up then for the comments from Martin. On the slide here, I'd say is a summary of the biggest complaints, the biggest challenges that businesses are facing right now. The number one problem that everybody is facing is very straightforward. It's getting supplier data. So I'm sure you all understand, you probably are dealing with this on a daily basis, that CBAM requires you to dig deep into your supply chain to get data that has never been collected before, according to a standard that the supply chain is entirely unfamiliar with, that being a standard that's based on the EU ETS model. Suppliers have the risk of losing access to the European market if they don't comply. But what counts as compliance? That is a difficult thing to answer. And the fact that the supply chain requires, the CBAM regulation is sort of iterative. You ask your suppliers to get data from their suppliers and get data from their suppliers, means that the whole thing is at risk of kind of freezing up. You know, everybody's waiting for somebody else to provide data. The second challenge that people see is that the data that they get is not reliable, it's inaccurate. As you know, we're in the transitional period where verification is not required under the rules, and so obviously nobody is verifying the data. But a lot of businesses who do understand CBAM, who have a very sophisticated understanding of CBAM, will still say to me, well, I don't see any point in investing in this process right now because no supplier of mine is going to put in the effort to get the numbers right because the data isn't going to be verified. Everything I'm getting is inaccurate, so it's pretty useless to me as a baseline for planning my taxes, and therefore they're not putting in the work at all. So I describe this as a chicken and egg problem. It will be solved when we get into the definitive period, but it's not a straightforward one right now. The third problem is this whole system that that is very kind of contemporary with regulation, which is a kind of peer-to-peer or distributed way of regulating business. So you get one business to regulate another. You get a European company to ask a non-European supplier for data, and the European business, it might be, for example, a metals importer, has to turn themselves into a miniature version of the European Commission, which is not what their core skill set is. And that takes a lot of getting used to. And then, of course, there's just a lot of variety and understanding. People know that the CBAM is out there. They know it applies to them, perhaps, but exactly what is involved, it is still a big learning curve for a lot of businesses. So a number of the problems that you can see on this slide, we feel we can manage, tackle, mitigate, and help with. And so if we go to the next slide, you'll see some of our thoughts on that. The first is that getting supplier data is absolutely solvable through software, right? At the moment, the default for businesses is to use spreadsheets and emails and create a plethora of information flowing backwards and forwards in an insecure fashion. To the extent that you can create software that creates a central portal for information sharing, that problem of supplier data can be managed and solved. And here it's important to say that there are going to be multiple CBAMs around the world. All of them will rely on this same system of data sharing. And so the more that CBAMs, plural, embed themselves around the world, the more we see a need for the private sector to come forward with independent portals that can actually help businesses to manage this data. And we've built one of them. Full disclosure, there are others available. So you should take that into consideration. But we absolutely know from our own experience that this model of having an independent reporting portal does work to make CBAM much more manageable for businesses. In terms of inaccurate supplier data, that is a problem that will solve itself through tighter enforcement 2026, but it will be quite a kind of sudden shock. In terms of the peer-to-peer regulation, there again, I think software can help, because you are asking one, if you get each company on a common platform, then the platform guides each part of the business through a common interface. In terms of the huge variety and understanding, we do our best through webinars and seminars like this to get the information out there, but the lead is obviously played by the European Commission. The European Commission, I think, has been exceptionally transparent in the information that it's put out there, but that doesn't mean to say that it is fully understood. And so I think more teaching is needed. And I'd also say that the fact that fines so far have been very light touch has been obviously something that's welcomed by the business community, but it has meant that there has been not a lot of incentive to kind of get this right from day one. And so maybe more of a carrot and stick approach might get people up the learning curve of understanding. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there are problems that definitely do need changes to the legislation. The first is the real oddity, and I think that I expect that Martin will concur on this, that we have a de minimis of just 150 euros, and that's odd for two reasons. First of all, it's an exceptionally small amount financially. Secondly, it doesn't relate to the weight of the product, and therefore it doesn't correlate at all to the amount of embedded CO2. So the example is given of someone in France here buying a drum stand on CBAM, which is all entirely made out of steel. That might be considered to be a metal good under the CBAM criteria. That would be 170 euros. Are they having to pay a CBAM charge? If so, it's slightly ridiculous. The product weighs probably half a kilogram. And the emissions are trivial that are associated with it. And we're asking consumers to get involved in something that really is a regulation designed around the needs of heavy industry and the carbon emissions of heavy industry. So that definitely needs addressing. Another problem that needs addressing, the fact that pre-consumer scrap and post-consumer scrap are treated the same under CBAM, means that there is a massive loophole for people to create to treat product that as zero emissions when it isn't. The fact that processed products are currently excluded from the lineup of CBAM goods does perhaps create a perverse incentive around further carbon leakage. And then I think it's very unfortunate, and I think the Commission would probably agree here, that indirect emissions for metals are not going to be facing the same CBAM penalty as direct emissions in the definitive period as things stand at the moment. And I do hope that that is something that can be addressed in the future. On the next slide, we've got one particular problem that we see a great deal of in our company, and it's the problem that commodities markets have a number of intermediaries that do not themselves add any emissions under CBAM. And those companies, you could call them distributors or stockholders, are required under CBAM to simply provide transparency as to where they bought the product from, who their suppliers are. And that's a very strange aspect of the regulation that seems just like an oversight to us. Because what we actually care about in CBAM is not who you buy it from, but what are the emissions of the product that you are selling. And it's perfectly possible for distributors to act in the same way as installations and pass on information on carbon data and not pass on supplier names. But for as long as they're required under CBAM to pass on supplier identities, that's just going to result in no information going through, because it's completely undermining the entire business model of a stockholder to give the customer transparency into the ultimate supplier of the product. So we really encourage the Commission to engage with this particular problem, as it's something that we see time and again, and it's very difficult for us to advise our customers on what really they should be doing about it. So on the next slide, we can put something more positive. Is it really worth actually going to the effort of getting data from individual factories. This is something that's never been done before. It's a hugely expansive piece of regulation. It's a big burden on business. Our view is yes. Our view is that the ultimately what we're doing here is we are pricing carbon. Pricing carbon has been proven to be the most effective way in which we're going to get to net zero. And indeed, CBAM is essential for the long-term operation of the ETS. And core to CBAM really working out is factory level data. And if we can get the world putting factory level data together, that is going to create profoundly positive incentives for each company worldwide to decarbonize on their own. So we think this is absolutely worth it, and we encourage the Commission to continue on this path. And also we will see experiments around the world on different systems. So the USA is considering under the incoming Trump administration something called the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which would be a similar system to CBAM, but probably wouldn't be differentiating at the factory level. So we will be able, over the next few years, to see different kinds of regulation kind of competing in the global marketplace. We'll see where it goes. But we think that getting this kind of factory level data is something that can have a profoundly positive effect on decarbonisation. On the next slide, I just sort of identify that there remains a lot of confusion out there. A lot of companies are going to face a tax, in practical terms it is a tax, in less than 12 months' time. And they don't yet know how to even calculate that because the relevant benchmarks haven't been published. The numbers that the scale of the tax is actually for some businesses exceptionally large and doesn't correlate with market size. So it may be that a lot of SMEs are facing huge tax burdens coming in less than 12 months' time. And I have to say, on behalf of the businesses that I talk to, that a lot of them simply just don't believe that this is going to happen, even though it's right there on the statute books and it will have been 3 years that they've had to get ready for it. They're just sort of saying, well, I'm sure it will be delayed. It's such a big thing, it will have to be delayed. And that's a bad approach, okay, but it's forgivable, it's understandable when still there's so much information that we've yet to receive. And there's a kind of a bit of an it feels like a bit of an essay crisis situation coming out of the Commission. There's a lot of implementing acts and delegated acts that we have yet to see even drafts of, that we're going to see over the course of the coming year. You've got the timetable there. A lot of this stuff, back end loaded towards the, just the months before the start of the definitive period. And that's just not ideal, has to be said. So confusion remains a real danger. On the final slide, I just want to say that we are offering a system that we believe can help with a great deal of the compliance challenges that businesses are facing with CBAM. And we'd be very happy to talk about that with you offline. The CBAMBOO platform puts importing businesses in control of their CBAM process, helps them engage with their supply chain in an efficient way, build a precise picture of their future costs. Every supplier out there who is not in the EU and does not have to submit a CBAM report is able to access the CBAM platform at no charge. So you can onboard your entire supply chain, and we offer detailed one-on-one assistance based on a team of experts that we've built here, a multidisciplinary team of experts focused on the CBAM process. You can go to cbamboo.com/demo to see a demo of it. You can message me via LinkedIn or email me, gabriel@cbamboo.com. I'd be delighted to take that conversation forward. For now, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk through some of businesses' concerns around CBAM, and looking forward to the next section of this webinar.
Thank you, Gabriel. This was very insightful. So now handing over to Martin to give us a different perspective from the legislator's point of view.
Yeah, many thanks. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks, Gabriel, for the indeed insightful and rich presentation. We had just for transparency, we had obviously a pre-call end of last year, and I encouraged Gabriel to focus on the negatives. So that these are very, very well taken, and many of them are also not new to us. Yes, maybe I start still. I understand that there is a good understanding of CBAM here in this group, but still maybe to explain also some of the issues that Gabriel pointed out, and rightly pointed out, where we came from and what's the starting point. And then back then I was not part of the CBAM team, the much smaller. It's still small, the CBAM team, I should say, in the commission. We are like 20 people working on this, but back then when it was created, there were like 4 or 5 people. I was in the advising the Director General at the time, so I remember quite well that they were. I mean, we are creating the first CBAM in the world. I mean, there's the one in California, but the first CBAM that applies to material products. And one of the challenges of this instrument is that it has to be built in a WTO compliant way, and that is it's of paramount importance for the Commission, but that leads to many of the technical issues that we are having and that we're discussing. I mean, one of the aspects, and there are other reasons why we go for actual emissions, climate policy objectives, and sort of transparency on supply chains that Gabriel mentioned. But there is also the pure WTO legal point that we need to use, need to build CBAM based on actual emissions, or at least allow for for actual emissions, and that's why we need to design this whole system around this concept. That is also, I mean, I go too far now, but I mean, that's also the question that one of the questions why indirect emissions are so far not included for all the sectors, because of the way that in the European Union currently the risk of carbon leakage is dealt with. That's this indirect cost compensation. That's a different mechanism than the free allowances in the ETS. The whole thing is anchored. That will be very different in the US if they go ahead with the CBAM. With the ETS, we are only speaking about carbon leakage that is stemming from the fact that the ETS exists in the Union, and it's only the price of the ETS that we try to mirror at the border. Maybe go to the next slide. And I think here can be very brief, but just to insist on the criteria that we use to select and that we will continue to base our work on is it's not the idea of CBAM to cover everything everywhere that is imported. And Gabriel already alluded to them. I mean, I will speak about the threshold issue, but indeed there is on the one hand the risk of carbon leakage and the ambition to be meaningful in terms of environmental impact, but on the other hand we have the practical feasibility. There we have to keep in mind that we have this complexity of a mechanism that for WTO reasons needs to be very closely methodologically linked to the ETS and only deviate from the methodology of the ETS where needed, but at the same time, it's a mechanism that applies to products and not to installations. So the system boundaries are different, and that creates some of the complexity. And that also means simply, I mean, unlike the ETS, we are speaking here about a much higher number of installations globally, a much higher number of players involved in the system currently, at least as it's designed in the Union, because it applies to importers and not only to the few producers, and that means that of course this question of practical feasibility is central. And that's why the Commission has started with a few sectors only, and with their basic state of production only. We can go to the next slide. So where are we now? As most of you know, we're starting now the last year of the transitional period, and I can reassure you, or I don't know, but I can be affirmative that there is no intention whatsoever to postpone the entry into force of the CBAM, or the entry into force of the obligation to acquire to pay a financial obligation from the 1st of January 2026. So this definitive period will start in 2026, and there's no indication and no plan to postpone this. What one should have in mind is, of course, the payment will only be then in 2027. So there's a bit more time. What we are doing now is indeed, on the one hand, monitoring what is happening so far, and at the same time preparing for the definitive period. Maybe we go to the next slide. So just to give you a snapshot of what we're seeing in terms of reports, you see relatively stable numbers now over the 4 quarters for which we have the numbers. The data that I have here is for the Q3. You see a bit less, but that's because the snapshot that I took was at the point when there were still possibilities to modify or add declarations for Q3 2024. There's possibly also an explanation that there's a lower number in Q3 2024 because that was the first reporting period where actual values had to be provided, which indeed is an issue, right now already, and but we are already now seeing, especially for the importers of quantities of significant quantities, quite a decent share of provision of actual emissions data. There's then a question on how reliable that data may be. We are assessing this, but of course, from 2026 onwards, this will be going through verification. We go for the next slide. The other bit that we're doing, and indeed that is something we are aware of, but it is the preparation of all the implementing and delegated acts that specify the functioning and the parameters of the CBAM from 2026 onwards in the definitive period. And there's no denying that we are later than we would like to be in the publication of some of these. It is a matter of it is simply a lot of work that is technically complex, that requires political guidance in a year also where we had a change in the college. We are doing what we can in the Commission to come forward with these as quickly as possible. But obviously, given that they're complex, it's also important to get it right. That sometimes takes some time. There's no denying that this is not ideal from a business perspective. We would like to have certainty and be able to plan, but it is what it is. Next slide, please. So while we are monitoring and while we are preparing for the definitive period, we are also, which means in terms of preparing the implementing legislation, we are also taking a broader view on the CBAM from our learnings so far, which is partly based on the data that we receive through the registry, partly through bilateral exchange with businesses, or partly through those webinars as today, where we get important and valuable feedback from the industry and from stakeholders. And there, I would say there are two blocks, two strands in which we are looking at the CBAM regulation. And the one is, with the lessons that we've learned, what can we do to simplify it? And understandably, I think when you create such a regulation for the first time, and that's also was a key element. I remember back then when we proposed as TAXUD to have this transitional period of 3 years, some of the stakeholders that were pushing for CBAM were criticizing us for being not bold enough. And it's very clear that these 3 years, and it was a bit less than 3 years in practice, were absolutely needed for authorities and for the business to learn to get acquainted with the system. But clearly there are elements that we didn't get right, and where we need to think about, and where we are actively working on finding solutions how CBAM could be simplified. One element that Gabriel already picked up, and I think it's I cannot say now what we are going to do, but it's very clear that we will need to find a way to for a different threshold that would determine whether you are within the scope of CBAM or not. It is both correct. Both what Gabriel said is correct. It's the level is too low to exclude meaningfully consignments, and secondly, it is not good to the CBAM is based on emissions. So the threshold should also be either based on emissions or based on a proxy that is strongly correlated with emissions, and that would be mass rather than value. So we are working on this. I cannot give you now specifics on the timeline, but it's the intention to be able to apply the simplifications, and there will be others that we are working on as early as possible in the definitive period. So that's the one strand. The other strand is, what do we do about the CBAM going forward? And one point that or a couple of points that Gabriel mentioned are related to the scope. And indeed, at the moment, we have only very few so-called downstream products, so products that are down the value chain of basic CBAM products in scope. And we are looking at indeed, and maybe we go to the next slide, sorry. Yes, and we're looking indeed at the merits of extending the scope to some of these downstream goods. The argument is quite clear. There are risks. I mean, there are a couple of risks that arise with CBAM now. The one is simply circumvention, that a good could be just, you could have an incentive now as a producer or importer sort of to just have a marginal production step outside the union, and that would then brings the product to a different CN code that would then be out of scope, and thereby circumvent the CBAM obligation. Or you have more the classic carbon leakage push downstream, that you either would be incentivized to replace the production of your good, you would replace indeed the acquisition of the good that you sourced previously from the union by an import of a downstream good, or you would move the production abroad. So we are assessing indeed in quite detail the risk of carbon leakage, how high it actually is for goods that are downstream to those goods that are currently in Annex 1 of the regulation. And of course, what we are doing is to compare the risk of carbon leakage and therefore the merits of including it in these goods into the CBAM with the technical feasibility and compliance burden. And that has two sides to it. The one is it's very plausible that these more processed goods will have an even more diverse set of importers, and there we'll have to think about how this interacts with a different threshold to avoid that we have even more marginal sort of importers in scope. And the other question is, of course, the more complex the good, the more processed the good, the more complicated it will be to calculate the embedded emissions. And we'll need to think about ways of, first of all, assess for which goods it's possible and how complicated it would be, and then about ways of simplifying possibly the methodology for this. Next slide, please. And then there is this, what we call the horizontal scope extension, and that's other sectors at risk of carbon leakage. And I should say, and that we'll see on the last slide that I will have in the deck, we are starting, and that's also, I suppose this is clear, but for some it's not clear. This all builds on the UTS. So if a sector is not in the UTS, there is no argument whatsoever that CBAM could help out. And even more specifically, the ETS, as it already had a system dealing with carbon leakage, there is a list of sectors that are considered at risk of carbon leakage. So these are the sectors that we're looking at the moment, and trying to identify those sectors, and then specifically products at CN code level or even further down, where we see a higher risk of carbon leakage, that are relevant in overall emissions terms, and where indeed the administrative and technical feasibility is proportional to the environmental benefits. yes, and the last slide is just, I think, the is just this table. Maybe a couple of words to conclude. I like a lot and this idea. I mean, I think what is really important. One thing is what we get unilaterally right in now trying to simplify and optimizing the CBAM as European Commission, and we need input, and that's that. The other bit is how does CBAM interact with activities of other countries around the world. The UK is obviously already preparing their version of a CBAM, which will be relatively similar to what the EU is doing. Other countries are planning their CBAMs as well, and indeed, if the US is going ahead with a CBAM, that would naturally be in many ways a very different system, because they don't have carbon pricing at federal level and therefore cannot build or anchor their system around that. But what all these systems will have more or less in common is the calculation of the need to be able to somehow establish the carbon content in the product. And that's where we invest a lot at international level, at the OECD, IFCMA, and also in the climate club, that is the G7 climate club, that we are at international level converging in terms of carbon intensity metrics and carbon footprint methodologies, so that we have a common understanding of what we're talking about, but more importantly, that businesses that are operating globally or internationally, if they are affected by several systems, that they don't have to report different stuff, yet similar but different stuff for different systems. That's also the bit that we are focusing on now in the revision of the CBAM methodology, is trying to find ways to make more use of what's out there already in terms of international standards, to be as close as possible to the ETS, the EU ETS, but still finding ways of, say, producers from countries like Korea that have an MRV system because they have an ETS, to reuse the data, the reporting that they are doing for Korean purposes, also for the purpose of the CBAM. So what we are very much focusing on is trying to get the compliance burden down to the extent possible without undermining the environmental objectives. And with that, I close. I hope I wasn't too long, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Martin. So here we had two perspectives, right? So thank you both for taking the time to go through the presentation. So with that, we now open the Q&A, session of this webinar. And yes, feel free to, raise your hands if you want to ask it directly. And I already do see that